Yeah, so this is our reading group on Simondon's Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. We missed last week because of connection issues, but we're picking up from where we were the week before, which is right at the bottom of page 369 of the translation. So we're maybe a third or halfway through the conclusion. So we're almost done with the book itself in the first volume, and then the second volume has the complementary texts, which we can look at when we get to them. So in the first part of the conclusion that we've gone through so far, he's returning to some ideas or concepts that he presented in the introduction, and then he kind of left them aside for most of the book, aside from a few sort of brief passages, and then he comes back to them. So this idea of the phases of being and dephasing of being, the sort of schema is of a pre-individual being, which is greater than unity. It's something that is not governed by the principle of excluded middle, and this state of pre-individual being is full of tensions and potentials for future transformation. So this pre-individual being splits into separate phases. So it splits into an individual and an associated milieu, which remains unindividuated. And then we have the final stage of this operation, which is something that doesn't always happen. It's a sort of contingent happening, is the formation of a collective in which the individual is incorporated. So you have pre-individual being, individuation, and then the formation of the collective. Those are the three stages that the process goes through. And so, yeah, and maybe I should just clarify that the stages here are not the same thing as the phases. So the phases are what the pre-individual being splits into. So the individual and the milieu are the phases, and then the stages are the stages of the process that I just outlined. And then so he talks about how this doctrine of the individual, or doctrine of individuation, is sort of the first philosophy. So if you start from a more traditional conception of the individual, and the individual as something in which the entities enter into relations, in particular the subject-object relation as a relationship between individuals that are already individuated. If you start from that conception, then you're already presupposing a doctrine of the individual, but you're not accounting for the individuation of that individual. And so for Simondon, this traditional conception of the subject and object as entities that secondarily come into relation with each other is already presupposing the nature of the individual, and the fact that the individual is exhaust reality. So everything that is an individual. So Simondon wants to get away from that presupposition and see what the consequences of breaking from that presupposition are. And then we have this development of this idea of how this doctrine of individuation is a way of accounting for becoming in a way that can't be grasped in an account of the individual, of being as the individual. And he points to Spinoza and Leibniz as two sort of failed attempts, or two instances where a form of substantialism, a doctrine in which the individual exhausts reality, leads to the absence of an understanding of becoming. And so for Spinoza, of course, there's only becoming from the perspective of finite beings, whereas in the infinite understanding of God, there's really no becoming, and everything is made up of eternal truths. And then for Leibniz, there's this doctrine of the individual concept, so that each substance, each individual, has its own concept, which contains within it everything that happens to that individual, or that individual does throughout its lifespan or period of existence. So like the example he gives is that the concept of Julius Caesar includes the fact that he would cross the Rubicon and be stabbed by Brutus, and so on. Everything in his life was included in that concept. And so there's this, in each case, there's a necessity about everything that happens because it's all included in the initial setup of the substance, whether it's the one substance of Spinoza or the infinitely many substances of Leibniz. And so because everything is already included in the beginning, there's really no becoming, or becoming is a sort of illusion. And so for Simondon to have a real grasp of becoming, we need to have an account of individuation that doesn't presuppose that the individual exhausts reality. And we see also his criticism of dialectics, and I think he's specifically thinking of Hegelian dialectics here. He suggests that in dialectics, the relationship between being and becoming is still too external. So there's no, so rather than having an account of how being becomes, we have instead being and becoming as two separate moments of the dialectic, and we have a transition from one to the other. And so for Simondon, this is still too external. So it's not a proper grasp of becoming as such. It's making being suffer the process of becoming rather than having being itself become. Let's see, what else do we have? I think that's about it for what we saw so far. Right, so we can pick up from the bottom of 369. So I'll read a page or so and then we'll continue. Such a conception could be considered gratuitous and treated as one usually treats the creationist hypothesis. What is the point of pushing back into an unknowable state of pre-individual being the forces that are destined to account for ontogenesis, if this state is only known through what follows it? If this were the case, it could indeed be said that the problem is merely pushed back, just as one does by supposing the prior existence of a creator being. This being is only presupposed as creative to the extent that the notion of creation serves to account for the created, such that the essence of the being invoked as creator is in fact fully known based on the result upon which one must fall back, i.e. being as created. Nevertheless, it seems that the hypothesis according to which a state of pre-individual being exists plays a different role than that of the usual creationist hypothesis. Indeed, this hypothesis concentrates all being in its origins, such that every creationism brings with it the problem of theodicy, the ethical aspect of a more general problem. Becoming is no longer a veritable becoming. It is fully whole, as though it had already happened in the act of creation, which obliges to contribute after the fact a certain number of local correctives to the creationist theory in order to give a meaning to becoming. Nevertheless, these correctives must most generally concern the points that upset the feeling that man has of becoming, for example, the problem of moral responsibility. But creationism should be corrected on all points, for it is no more satisfying to annihilate the reality of physical becoming than to diminish that of the becoming of the human being as an ethical subject. This difference of treatment can only be justified by a dualism that is itself contestable. There would be a need to add a veritable physical theodicy to the ethical theodicy. On the contrary, the hypothesis of a pre-individual state of being is not totally gratuitous. It contains more than it seeks to explain. It is not solely formed based on the examination of the existence of individuals. It is derived from a certain number of schemata of thought borrowed from the domains of physics, biology, and technology. Physics does not reveal the existence of a pre-individual reality, but it shows that there are geneses of individualized realities based on standard states. A photon is a physical individual in a certain sense. However, it is also a quantity of energy that can reveal itself in transformation. An individual like an electron is in interaction with fields. A structural change of a molecular, atomic, or nuclear edifice produces energy and engenders physical individuals. Physics urges us to think the individual as exchangeable with the structural modification of a system, and thus with a certain definite system state. In the foundation of the ontogenesis of physical beings, there is a general theory of the exchanges and modifications of states that could be called allegmatics. This conceptual ensemble supposes that the individual is not an absolute becoming, and that its genesis can be studied based on a certain number of energetic and structural conditions. Ontogenesis pertains to the becoming of systems. The appearance of an individual corresponds to a certain system state and presents a meaning relative to this system. Furthermore, the physical individual is relative, it is not substantial. It is relative because it is in relation, quite particularly in energetic relation with fields, and this relation is part of its being. In wave mechanics, an electron has its associated wavelength. In the Davison-Dermer experiment, electrons can be made to interfere. However, electrons are considered as bits of electricity, indivisible charges. This existence of the phenomenon of interference, and generally of all phenomena which are accounted for by defining the associated wavelength, shows that there is a sort of physical collective within which the role of the individual is no longer merely an apportioned role, for which one would want to account by means of the notion of substance. The microphysical individual is as much an energetic reality as a substantial being. It adheres to its genesis and remains present in its becoming, since it is in perpetual relation with fields. The individual is not the entirety of the being. It is only an aspect of the being. What matters is the study of the conditions in which the being manifests as individual, as if this involved not the being, but a manner of being or a moment of being. In physics, there is a pre-individual being and a post-individual being. A photon disappears and becomes the structural change of an atomic edifice, or instead it changes wavelength as if it had become other. Individuality becomes functional in some way. It is not the sole aspect of reality, but a certain function of reality. Right, so here we have a continuation of the criticism of substantialism, and in particular, this is in relation to Leibniz, because Leibniz has a book on Theodicy, and so for Leibniz, of course, there's the famous doctrine that this is the best of all possible worlds, that God chose out of the ensemble of possible worlds, the one that maximizes the amount of existence with the minimum number of laws that generate it. So this world is the optimal world in that sense, and of course this idea of the best of all possible worlds is hard to reconcile with the existence of evil in various forms, unnecessary suffering, or whatever you want to point to, and so Leibniz has to sort of evade that problem and argue that the suffering in the part, or the what seems to be evil from the perspective of a finite being, is actually contributing to the greater good in the long run, and so there's a doctrine of the contribution of the finite part to the greater good of the whole, but I think this type of doctrine is generally considered not very satisfying. It's hard to take the greater good of the whole as consolation if you were the one who is suffering from the evil in the part. But Simondon here is arguing that this type of theodicy that Leibniz has to do to try to reconcile the moral principles of human beings with the absence of becoming in his system. This would apply also to physical becoming, or to any other form of becoming. It's just a question of what seems most relevant to us as human beings is of course human affairs, and so the same type of problem of reconciling coming with the idea that everything is already predetermined at the outset, that same problem would arise for physical individuation or the physical domain, as well as for the human domain. And this is something that in connection with contemporary physics is still a sort of an issue that hasn't been resolved, because certain depending on the types of models that people use, some of them involve the idea that time is an emergent property, so that time is not a fundamental property of the universe, and it's something that is sort of grounded in something more fundamental, and so that suggests that the experience of time that we have is in some sense illusory, or doesn't represent the underlying reality of the universe. And if that's the case, then our understanding of the future as contingent is mistaken. We have a representation of the future as contingent, but in reality, everything is already sort of predetermined. You can't even say predetermined, but it's determined outside of time by whatever underlying reality this model posits. So this is still an open problem in physics, in short. We have a comment from Angus in the chat saying, I wonder if explicitly founding your philosophy on schemata from physical sciences puts it in danger of either becoming outdated or being accused of improperly applying or understanding those sciences. Yes, I think that's a danger, for sure, that there are parts of what Simoneau talks about in this book that are outdated, given that it was written in the 1950s. There have been a lot of advances in science that obviously he couldn't have accounted for. But I think he would say that this is a risk that you have to take. You have to be able to grasp these schemas or schemata of understanding individuation. So it's only by taking these schemata of thought from whatever domain of human understanding seems to have these schemata available. So in this case, it would be science. It's only if you can draw from any particular domain of human understanding that you can adopt these new ways of thinking. And so he, at one point in this conclusion, I can't remember if we have already read it or if it comes later, but he suggests that the use of paradigms drawn from physical reality is necessary because of the way that the hylomorphic schema is sort of imposed on our thinking by our prevailing culture. And he talks about this a little bit more in a slightly different context in his other book on the mode of existence of technical objects. He talks about how our cultural representations draw from essentially obsolete technology and science, the technology and science of the classical world are sort of metaphors and the modes of thinking that we sort of have recourse to in our culture are obsolete ones, in the sense that they don't correspond to the existing state of technology and science, and so it's necessary to overcome these obsolete schemata of thought. We have to use the science of our day, even though, of course, it will eventually become obsolete in its turn. But then there would be a new operation of thought using the new science that would have to occur.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense that he would say that we're already doing this anyway, just, as he shows in the brick making example, that schema is inadequate, but it's also a scientific or a technological schema.
Yeah, exactly. So there, even when you sort of set out to operate by sort of pure thought, or to not use some sort of technical schema, you're still using a technical schema, just one that is not made explicit. And so because it's because it's not made explicit, that means that you're sort of importing in all the assumptions that schema presupposes, without having a critical understanding of whether these presuppositions are valid or not. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit on 371, I believe is where we are.
I can read.
Sure.
By generalizing this relativization of the individual and by transporting it into the reflexive domain, the study of individuation can be transformed into a theory of being. Individuation is then situated with respect to being. It appears as a modification of the being based upon which the latter's problematic becomes enriched. It is the appearance of information within the being system. Instead of treating information as an absolute parameter that is measurable and quantifiable in a limited number of circumstances, it must be linked to individuation. There is information only as an exchange between the parts of a system that involve individuation. Because in order for information to exist, it must have a sense, and it must be received, i.e., it must be able to serve to carry out a certain operation. Information is defined by the way in which an individuated system affects itself by conditioning itself. It is that through which there is a certain mode of conditioning of the being by itself, a mode that can be called internal resonance. Information is individuating and requires a certain degree of individuation in order to be able to be received. It is that through which the operation of individuation progresses, that through which this operation conditions itself. Form taking, through which individuation is generally represented, presupposes information and serves as a basis for information. There is information exchanged only between already individuated beings and within a systematics of the being that constitutes a new individuation. It could be said that information is always internal. Information must not be confused with the signals and signal supports that constitute its mediator. Information must be understood in the veritable conditions of its genesis, which are the very conditions of individuation in which it plays a role. Information is a certain aspect of individuation. In order for it to be understood as having a sense, that without which it is not information, but merely a weak energy, there must be a certain potential prior to itself. The fact that an information is veritably information is identical to the fact that something individuates. And information is exchange, the modality of internal resonance according to which this individuation effectuates itself. Every information is both informing and informed. It must be grasped in this active transition of the being that is individuating. It is that through which being phase shifts and becomes. In its separate, recorded, indirectly transmitted aspects, information also expresses a complete individuation and the resurgence of this completion that can extend into other stages of amplification. Information is never after individuation alone, for if it expresses a completed individuation, it does so with respect to another individuation that is capable of being completed. As the expression of a completed individuation, information is the seed around which a new individuation will be able to complete itself. It establishes the transductivity of successive individuations, arranging them into a series, insofar as it traverses them by carrying what can be taken back up from one individuation to the next. Information is that which overflows from one individuation to the next and from the pre-individual to the individuated, since the schema according to which an individuation completes itself is capable of initiating other individuations. Information has an exterior power because it is an interior solution. It is that which passes from one problem to the next, that which can radiate from one domain of individuation to another domain of individuation. Information is significative information because it is initially the schema according to which a system has successfully individuated. This is why information can become the schema for another system. This supposes that there is an analogy between the first and second system. However, in a doctrine that avoids invoking a creationist postulate in order for there to be an analogy between the two systems, these two systems must belong to a vaster system. This means that when information appears in a subset as a schema of resolution of this subset, it is already the resolution not only of this subset, but also of that within which it expresses its belonging to the set. It is from the start capable of being transferred to other subsets. It is from the start interior to the original subset and already interior to the set, as expressing that which in each subset is its mark of belonging to the set, i.e. the manner in which it is modified by the other subsets that constitute the set with it. It could be said that information is both interior and exterior. It expresses the limits of a subset. It is the mediation between the set and each subset. It is the internal resonance of the set insofar as it includes subsets. It realizes the individuation of the set as the progress of solutions between the subsets that constitute it. It is the internal resonance of the structures of subsets within the set. This exchange is interior relative to the set and exterior relative to each of the subsets. Information expresses the immanence of the set in each of the subsets and the existence of the set as a group of subsets, really incorporating the quiddity of each subset, which is the reciprocal of the immanence of the set to each of the subsets. If there is indeed a dependence of each subset relative to the set, there is also a dependence of the set relative to the subsets. The reciprocity between two levels designates what can be called the internal resonance of the set, and it defines the set as a reality undergoing individuation. It seems like the idea with the sets and the subsets here is that in order for there to be information between two sets, they actually have to be subsets of a larger set. I'm not entirely sure I understand what that has to do with creationism, unless his point is just that, since it's a kind of ongoing becoming through these successive informations, we can't sort of put all of the becoming at the beginning. I'm not really sure I follow that, though.
I think the connection with the criticism of creationism has to do with the rejection of any sort of pre-established harmony hypothesis, so pre-established harmony was another of Leibniz's concepts, which he used to account for the apparent coordination between different substances. So each substance is sort of has its own internal concept and evolves in accordance with that concept. But all the different substances are constituted in such a way that it seems as if they are influencing each other, even though each one is actually evolving according to its own internal concept. And so the fact of this apparent coordination is what Leibniz calls pre-established harmony. And so it's a doctrine like this, I think, that Simondon is criticizing. It would be a doctrine in which the possibility for the transmission of information would rest on some sort of choice of the creator to make different domains compatible with each other. And so these domains would have this pre-established harmony between each other. And so what Simondon is arguing here is that if we reject this supposition of a creator that makes the domains compatible with each other, then the only way for that compatibility to occur is if those two domains are part of a broader domain that includes both of them, and then we can have the transmission of information between the two domains, or the process of individuation that occurs in one domain can be transferred to another domain.
Does this mean that there's like one final set that grounds all of the subsets?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems as if this theory of information requires that that there has to be a whole in which every other component every other reality is a component of that whole, so this language of sets and subsets makes that notion problematic, because in set theory, of course, there's a famous result that there is no set of all sets. There's no total set, and Simondon uses the language of sets here, but he doesn't seem to be appealing to set theory as an established mathematical discipline, and it does seem as if his argument seems to lead to the conclusion that there would be a set of all sets, or a total set.
So, is it the idea like it's a finite being constitutes like a infinite being, like in a way, like it reminds me of like the Spinoza, like does it have some kind of relation to like a Spinozan idea, like there could be some infinite being, and then in it each finite being like plays a role, like it's part of the infinite being, if infinite eternity, whatever. And then plus, like I don't know how, like it sounds like Simondon tried to criticize the Leibniz, but in what part like there could be distinction? Like it seems like to have some kind of overlapping kind of idea. I mean, the previous part and then this one altogether.
So the Spinoza point is that's a good question, because as we've seen earlier, he's criticized Spinoza as not being able to account for becoming. But you're right that this notion of a total set in which everything else would be a part is sort of similar to the Spinozist substance in which everything else is inheres. So I guess a question that you could, or an objection that could be raised to that conception would be that we're still sort of putting everything in at the beginning. If we take it that this pre-individual being is a sort of all-encompassing reality in which everything else, or out of which everything else is individuated afterwards, then we're still, in some sense, putting all of the reality into this pre-individual being at the beginning, and then everything else is sort of coming out of it later. But it's just kind of drawing the consequences of what already existed. And I think how Simondon would answer that is that the process of individuation is a real becoming, in the sense that it involves a kind of discovery. So the portions of this pre-individual reality, or the aspects of this pre-individual reality, are not compatible until this discovery of their compatibility. And So like the standard example of the disparate retinal images are the two images are incompatible until the organism discovers the dimension of depth, which makes them compatible. And so I think for him, it's this aspect of discovery that makes it different than the Spinoza's notion of the one substance, because there's this real discovery and real becoming that individuation consists in, which doesn't occur in the Spinozist system.
So that means there could be multiple layers of a possibility or potentiality, like in terms of becoming. So it's not predestined becoming or becoming. So it could be, it emphasizes, Simon de Moore emphasizes like autonomy of becoming. Like there could be more possibility. I mean, nothing is like a predetermined or something like that. That's the point.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think because there's this notion of becoming as a discovery, that means that there's no predestination, and so there's certain contingency that is built into his conception of individuation. So it's only a discovery because it could have been otherwise. The process of individuation could have occurred in a different way or not at all, and so because of that, it means that the whole development is not included in the beginning in the way that it is for Spinoza.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's an important point, I think. Right, so let's go on to the next page or so. So we are at 373, about halfway down the page. If someone would like to pick up from there.
I can read. 373?
Yes, we're at Can a Theory of Individuation.
I try to see like through my paper, but better read this using this one. 373. Can a theory, that one?
Yes.
Can a theory of individuation provide an ethics through an intermediary of notion of information? It can at least serve to lay down the basis of an ethics, even if it cannot complete the letter due to the incapacity to present its circumstances. In philosophical systems, ethics is generally divided into two paths that diverge and never rejoin: that of pure ethics, that of applied ethics. This duality stems from the fact that substances is separate from becoming, and because being, which is defined as one and completely given in individuated substance, is finished. Thus, on the level of the essences and outside becoming, there arises a pure ethics that can only manage to preserve the theoretical substantiality of the individuated being, and in fact surrounds the latter with an illusion of substantiality. This first path of the ethics, which could be called a substantializing ethics, or the ethics of sage, or contemplative ethics, is only valid for a state of exception, which would not itself be stable without its opposition to the state of passion, servitude, vice, and existence in the here and now. The substantiality is merely a counter-existence, an anti-becoming, and life must become around it so that it can acquire the impression of substantiality by contrast. Contemplative virtue requires merchants and madmen, just as the sober man requires the drunk man in order to be aware of being sober, and the adult needs the child to know what it is to be adult. It's only through an effect of a perceptive and affective relativity that this ethics can seem like an ethics of wisdom, seeking the immutability of being. The same applies for the other branch of ethics, which is allegedly practical. It is only practical relative to the first type of ethics, and it utilizes the value defined by the first in order to have the ability to be constitute itself with this stability. In fact, what has a signification is the pair of the two ethics, not each ethics by itself. Nevertheless, they define norms that provide incompatible directions, i.e., they create divergence. Their very pairing is insufficient, in that it merely possesses a common logical axiomatic, not mutually coherent normative directions. The ethics of becoming ends of action in the present requires the ethics of wisdom turned towards eternity in order to be aware of itself as an ethics of action. It is in harmony with itself more so in what it refuses than in what it constructs. Just like the ethics of wisdom, the internal coherence of each of these ethics forms, by way of the negative, as a refuser of the path of the other ethics. Continue?
Yeah, sure.
The notion of communication as identical to the internal resonance of a system undergoing individuation can on the contrary endeavor to grasp being in its becoming without granting a privilege to the immobile essence of being, or to becoming core becoming. There can be a single and complete ethics only to the extent in which the becoming of a being is grasped as being itself, i.e., to the extent that becoming is known as the being's becoming. The two opposite ethics, pure theoretical ethics and practical ethics, separate interiorly and exteriorly relative to individuated being because, for the ethics of a contemplation, individuation is considered anterior to the moment in which becoming conscious is achieved, and for practical ethics, as always posterior to this moment. Theoretical ethics is a perpetual nostalgia for the individuated being in its purity, just as practical ethics is an ever renewed preparation for an ever deferred ontogenesis. Neither of the two can grasp and accompany being in its individuation. However, if individuation is considered as conditioned by the internal resonance of a system and can effectuate itself practically fractionally by way of a successive constitution of metastable equilibria, we can neither accept an ethics of being's eternity, which seeks to consecrate a structure that is discovered once and for all as definitive and eternal, one that is consequently an eminently respectable structure, the first and last term reference, a structure that translates itself into norms that are absolutely like it. Nor accept the perpetual evolution of the ever-moving being that becomes and changes continually throughout all the mobile circumstances that condition, action, and incessantly modify the norms according to which action must develop in order to accompany this ongoing evolution. The notion of successive series of metastable equilibria must be substituted for the stability of the unconditional absolute and this perpetual evolution of a fluid relativity. Norms are the lines of internal coherence of each of these equilibria, and values are lines according to which the structures of system translate themselves into the structures of the system that replaces the former system. Values are that through which the norms of system can become the norms of another system through a change of structures. Values established can make possible the transductivity of norms, not as a permanent norm that is nobler than the others, for it would be quite difficult to discover a norm that was already truly given, but as a meaning of axiomatic of becoming that is conserved from one metastable to the next. Values are the capacity implicative transfer contained in the system of norms, i.e., they are norms that to the state of information. They are what is a conserved form from one state to another. Everything is relative, except the very formula of this relativity. a formula according to which a stem of norms can be converted into another system of norms, surpassing the system in its given form. Normativity itself can be considered as value, i.e., as that which passes from one state to another. Take one by one, the norms of a system are functional and seem to exhaust their meaning in its functionality. But the system is more than functional, and this is why it is value. It could be said the value is the relativity of a system of norms, and is known and defined within the system of norms itself. In order for the normativity of the system of norms to be complete, it is necessary that within the very system its own destruction as a system and its possibility of translation into another system must be predicted according to a constructive order. That the system knows its own relativity within itself, that it is formed according to where is it? Sorry. According to this relativity, its own metastability being incorporated into the conditions of equilibrium, such as the path according to which the two ethics will have to coincide.
We might want to just because it's like a 3-page paragraph. Yeah. Just take a break at this point.
Here, coincide. That's it.
Yeah, we can stop here. That's fine. Sorry, I should have stopped you a little bit earlier because this is a giant multi-page paragraph like we've seen before. So thanks. So there's a bit of a shift in, or actually a pretty strong shift in the focus towards the end of this conclusion to this notion of ethics, which we've seen a little bit about before. Like he's had these sort of asides throughout the text where he talks about ethics, and so Angus has pointed back to one on when he talks about spirituality, and he talks about these different figures of the sage and the hero, and I forget what the third one is, but these different sort of ethical figures that are different instances of ethical life, and so here we get an ethics of individuation sort of developed over the last 5 pages or so of this book, and he sets out, as he does with many other concepts, he sets it out by starting from this opposition between the two extremes of a series, and then he wants to find a middle ground out of which those two extremes will be generated. And so in this case, it's this pure ethics versus applied ethics opposition. So the pure ethics is the ethics of substantiality. So it's an ethics that would be eternal, and it would be an ethics that is opposed to the becoming of reality. And so his criticism of this ethics is that it and he makes the same criticism of the applied ethics as well, but criticism is that it can only really formulate itself in opposition to the other form of ethics. So this ethics of this pure ethics can only formulate itself by opposing itself to the ways of the world or something along those lines. So you can have a figure of the sage as someone who withdraws from the world and lives the pure life that is sort of separate from the becoming in reality. But this figure only makes sense in opposition to a world of becoming, a world in which a world governed by an ethics that is not an ethics of eternity. And then likewise, if you look at the other side, this applied ethics, this would be an ethics that is always shifting. It doesn't recognize any permanent reality, and it's always adapting to circumstances. And so this kind of ethics, likewise, can only recognize itself as applied by opposing itself to the pure ethics. It can only set itself out or formulate itself insofar as it is an ethics of the world as opposed to an otherworldly ethics. And what Simondon wants to do, as we'll see as we continue reading, is to find the points, the intermediate points between these two ethics that serves as the point from which each of them can be generated. And he's going to, we already see the beginning of this development in the part that we just read, this opposition between norms and values. And he's going to develop this further as we continue. So the norms have to do with what's included within the norms belong to each of these ethics. So each ethic proposes certain norms for behavior. It says that doing this kind of thing is good and doing this other kind of thing is bad. But then the values are what sort of goes beyond any one particular ethics, and it's what passes from one ethics to the other. So it's you might have a system of ethics that says obeying your parents or obeying authority figures is an important norm, and there would be so that you would have a system of norms like that, and you would have a system of principles for what types of behavior is ethical, and then values would be the capacity that some of those norms would have for being transferred or passing into another system of ethics. So there might be an ethics of a value of justice, for example, that might be something that can pass from one system of ethics to another one. It's something that goes beyond any one system of ethics. And we'll see more on this opposition between norms and values as we continue. But what he argues here in the last bit that we read is that this opposition between the two ethics is itself something that we have to account for in terms of the norms and values. So it's only like this opposition of the two ethics, the pure ethics and the applied ethics, is itself something that is a form of ethics. Like it's the system formed by the two together that is a sort of coherent ethics, and not each one on its own. And then there's a development or a passage in here on functionality, and this idea. So norms are taken to be functional. So this is a sort of sociological understanding of norms. So like a society has norms of behavior that govern the behavior of the members of that society, and make the members of the society behave in a way that allows for the society to continue to exist and reproduce itself from one moment to the next, and sort of continue in existence. And so the norms would be functional in that sense. They contribute to the ongoing functioning of the society. But then there's another side to these principles in which they sort of go beyond anything functional. So like a principle like something like justice it can be used as a norm for the functioning of society, and say it's just for certain people to do certain things and to have a certain distribution of tasks within a society, for example. But then the same principle of justice can also be used against a certain social order and say that this social order is unjust, and to make demands of a different social order. So the same principle can serve as a norm insofar as it's functional to for the ongoing functioning of a society, and it can also serve as a value insofar as it exceeds or goes beyond what is functional within that society. Okay, so let's go on. Let's see if we can maybe push through and finish the conclusion today, because we got farther than I expected at this point. So I can read the next bit. Let's see, where did we end? Right, so we ended with the two ethics will have to coincide. Okay. The tendency toward eternity then becomes the awareness of the relative, which is no longer a will to halt becoming or to make an origin absolute, and to grant a normative privilege to a structure, but the knowledge of the metastability of norms, the awareness of the meaning of transfer that the individual qua individual has. The will to find absolute and immutable norms corresponds to this veridical feeling according to which there is something that must not be lost and which, surpassing adaptation to becoming, must possess the power to guide becoming. But this guiding force that is not lost cannot be a norm. Such a search for an absolute norm can lead only to a morality of wisdom as separation, withdrawal, and leisure, which is a way of mimicking eternity and timelessness within the becoming of a life. During this time, vital and social becoming continues, and the sage becomes a sage figure. He plays the role of a sage in his century as one who watches life pass and the passions dwindle. If he is not of that century, at least his role as a man who is not of the century is indeed in becoming. Wisdom is not universalizable because it does not assume the whole of becoming, and because it transforms becoming into a mythical representation. Like wisdom, sainthood or the other styles of individual life are extreme terms that illustrate the poles of moral life, but not the elements of moral life. On the basis of wisdom, sainthood, or any moral attitude of this type, the moral life cannot be recreated by combination, since there is no preoccupation of universality in these lifestyles that are taken as absolute, and are nevertheless not universalizable. They require contemporary life in front of them in order to be what they are. They require a basis of contemporary life that they can negate. A veritable ethics would be one that accounted for contemporary life without becoming numb in the contemporaneity of this life, which should define through norms a meaning that surpasses them. Furthermore, morality is quite generally attempts to fill in this interval between that through which a morality has value and the tendency to fall back, starting from principles of value, onto the norms discovered in contemporary life. But the act of linking between foundations and norms is often arbitrary and poorly formed. It is ethics in its center that is faulty. There is also a central dark zone in this domain between form and matter, between principle and consequences. Values would have to be not above norms, but across them, as the internal resonance of the network that they form, and as their amplificative power. Norms could be conceived as expressing a definite individuation and consequently as having a structural and functional meaning on the level of individuated beings. On the contrary, values can be conceived as linked to the very birth of norms, which expresses the fact that norms emerge with an individuation and last as long as this individuation exists as an actual state. The plurality of systems of norms can consequently be envisioned otherwise than as a contradiction. There is no contradiction arising from the multiplicity of norms except if one makes of the individual an absolute and not the expression of an individuation. It creates a merely provisional and metastable state as a discontinuous phase of transfer. Okay, I'll stop here. Right, so he is again alluding to the earlier passage where he talks about the role of the sage and the saint and the hero as these figures of spirituality, and here they're serving as figures of ethical life, and he's arguing here that these figures only make sense in opposition to the goings on of the world, and so it's only by opposing oneself to the world and to everyday affairs and so on, that you can become a sage or a saint. And this figure of the saint is a relative one because of that. It's not an absolute way of sort of reaching that substantial ethical life. And then likewise, in the other direction, he doesn't develop this as much, but we have the similar type of idea in the other direction, so that it's only because there is something like a saint or a sage that the everyday ethics or the ethics of everyday life can sort of make itself known as an ethics of everyday life. So someone who a person can only sort of know themselves and make themselves known as a practical person, insofar as someone else is an impractical person. So it's this opposition that sort of sets someone up as a practical person, as someone who is integrated into the life of the world and who adapts to circumstances in the proper way. And then he talks about how morality, so systems of morality, are sort of set out as ways to bridge the gap between norms and values. And so there's this, there's always this, so I guess there's two opposite errors that you can fall into. So on the one hand, if you sort of hold on to the value side at the expense of the norms, then you end up just retreating into the figure of the sage or the saint or the person outside of you fall back into the pure ethics side of the equation. And then on the other hand, if you hold on to the norms and the way that norms are part of the functioning of a society, then you end up identifying the norms of your society with eternal values, and so you just sort of identify the two, and you treat your own society's norms as if they were eternal values that transcend any given society. And then, so what you're doing is effectively losing sight of the value side of the equation. So the way that these principles transcend any given set of institutions, you're losing sight of that, and you're effectively just integrating yourself into the everyday ethics, the applied ethics, rather than the pure one. So either approach to setting out a moral system is flawed because it only holds on to one side of this opposition rather than grasping both of them together. And then the last bit here is about how an understanding that grasps both the norms and the values at the same time would be one in which the multiplicity of norms is no longer a contradiction. And so this is, of course, one of the sort of key problems of an ethics is that there are multiple different systems of norms in terms of different societies or different groups within a society will have different ideas about what is a good life and what is a good action and what is a bad action and so on. And so these different ethics are seemingly contradictory to each other. If one says that doing X is good and another one says that doing X is bad, then you have a contradiction between the two. And so Simondon here is arguing that if we have if we can achieve this grasp of norms and values at the same time, then we sort of surpass this level at which the multiplicity of norms is a contradiction. And so we reach a form of understanding in which the norms are the norms correspond with an individuation, and so insofar as that individuation is continuing, then those norms are valid for that individuation, and then for a different individuation, different norms would be valid, and so there's no contradiction between the two, insofar as the two individuations are different.
So I have two questions regarding that. The first one is like, then Simongdong, if I focusing on the ontogenesis, I think Simongdong is like focusing on generating something new, like in terms of a value and the ethics, and then it constitutes like something new, like in terms of the ethics and in terms of a collectivity. That makes sense, but at the same time, my question is like, then Simongdong doesn't accept the idea that like there could be some eternal truth. Like at the end of the day, like maybe like a human being through individuation, we can like make something, generate some new ethics at the end of the day. But that's all. Like, or Simongdong doesn't allow the idea like there could be some kind of going back to the Spinoza or some other philosophers, like there could be some kind of eternal truth or some truth, something like that. And the second question is that regarding information, then Simongdong thinks like passing information through from previous one to the next one, then that that information means here extracted the value and then ethics altogether. I mean, it's like some to make some new collectivity, like among, I mean, from the values, like someone would extract some value, like not the whole thing, and then that is mingled with the ethics, and then that one is as an information would be passed down to next generation or next individuation, whatever. That these are my two questions.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. I'll start with the question about eternal truths. I think you're right to say that for Simondon, there isn't such a thing as an eternal ethical truth. So there's nothing. There's no set of norms that you can say these are like the eternal ethical norms, and everyone should orient their lives around these ethical norms. But he also points to, he wants to sort of account for the intuition or the feeling that we have that there is something about ethical life that is not simply functional. So it's not just a set of norms that are sort of established for the functioning of a particular society. We have a feeling or an intuition that there's something that surpasses any given society, and can be used to contest the way that a society is arranged. And so for Simondon, it's this value aspect that accounts for that feeling of something that goes beyond any particular society. And so it's only if we can grasp both the norm side and the value side at the same time, or we can bring about the genesis of norms and values together. It's only then that we can have an understanding in which we have norms that are contingent and historical and belong to a certain society, and then at the same time have values that go beyond any given society. So for the second question, I think you're right again that these values or the the way that the principles play the role of values has to do with information, because as we saw just a few pages earlier, when he talks about information, he's talking about something that is that can pass from one individuation to another, and so values are what passes from one individuation to another, whereas norms are relative to a particular individuation. And so this notion of information as what can pass from one individuation to another is part of how we can grasp the concept of values and norms at the same time. So it's only because we understand individuation, or insofar as we understand individuation through this notion of information, that we can grasp values together with norms and not see them as opposed to each other.
Thank you. Just a simple following question is like, then norms can be turned into values at the end of the day?
I think rather than having norms turn into values, I think the way Simondon would present it is that norms and or every principle of ethics is both a norm and a value, or it has a norm aspect and a value aspect, so that you can any particular principle of an ethical system or a ethical life can serve as a norm or as a value, depending on what role it's playing in a larger system.
All right. Thank you.
Right, so let's go on to the next page or so. So we're at the bottom of 376, considered as harboring, if someone would like to pick up from there.
I can read. Considered as harboring a non-individuated reality within it, the being becomes a moral subject insofar as it is the association of an individuated reality and a non-individuated reality. To want to grant primacy to being insofar as it is individuated, or to being insofar as it is not individuated, is to oppose norms which are relative to the individuated being within a system to values which are relative to the non-individuated reality associated with the individuated being. I think someone's mic is on if you want to mute or go push to talk. Morality is neither in norms nor in values, but in their communication grasped in its real center. Norms and values are the extreme terms of the being's dynamic, terms which do not consist in themselves and are not sustained in the being by themselves. There is no problem of the relation of values to norms, of the opposition of open morality and closed morality, but a problem of the phase shift of ethics. A retroactive illusion makes it seem like historical progress progressively opens ethics and replaces closed moralities with open moralities. Each new state of a civilization contributes opening and closing based on a single center. Opening and closing are the dimensions of an indefinite, unidimensional, and bipolar dyad. Every act, every functional structuration tends to spread out into norms and values according to a correlative couple. Norms and values do not exist prior to the system of being in which they appear. They are becoming, instead of appearing and becoming without being part of becoming. There is a historicity of the emergence of values, just as there is a historicity of the constitution of norms. Ethics cannot be recreated based on norms or based on values, no more than the being can be recreated based on the forms and matters to which abstractive analysis reduces the conditions of ontogenesis. Ethics is the requirement according to which there is a significative correlation of norms and values. To grasp ethics in its unity requires that one accompany ontogenesis. Ethics is the meaning of individuation, the meaning of the synergy of successive individuations. It is the meaning of the transductivity of becoming, the meaning according to which in each act there is both movement to go further and the schema that will integrate into other schemata. It is the meaning according to which the interiority of an act has a meaning in exteriority. To postulate that the interior meaning is also an exterior meaning, that there are no deserted islands in becoming, no eternally self-enclosed regions, no absolute autarky of the instant, is to affirm that each activity has a meaning of information and is symbolic relative to life as a whole and to the totality of lives. There is ethics to the extent that there is information, i.e., signification overcoming a disparation of elements of beings, thus making it such that what is interior is also exterior. The value of an act is not its universalizable nature according to the norm that it implies, but the effective reality of its integration in a network of acts that becoming is. This, in fact, concerns a network and not a chain of acts. The chain of acts is an abstract simplification of the network. Ethical reality is indeed structured in a network because there is a resonance of acts with respect to one another, not by way of their implicit or explicit norms, but directly in the system that they form, i.e., the being's becoming. The reduction to norms is identical to the reduction to forms. It only involves one of the extreme terms of the real. Should I stop there?
Yeah, I think so. The rest of the page is one paragraph. So yeah, let's stop here. Right. So he's continuing this development around norms and values and this idea that a true ethics has to grasp both at the same time. So this, again, has to do with the reality of information and the way that information allows for an understanding of individuation, not as something that it comes about through the application of a form to a matter, but instead as something that is the result of a process of ontogenesis in something that is not individuated. And this grasp of individuated reality as only part of reality is essential to understanding ethics as involving both norms and values. So Angus, I think you're right. The same action creates both a norm and a value. Does this mean that the norm is like the individual and the value is the milieu? I think that's right. So the norms corresponds to the individual, and the values corresponds to the milieu. And so it's because the values are not individuated that they can, or that they correspond to the non-individuated aspect of reality, that they can pass from one system of ethical life to another. They are not sort of bound to one system in the way that norms are. But at the same time, it's only because there are norms that the values can have any sort of efficacy in the world. So it's only because the values are at the same time norms that they govern the actual concrete ethical life of individuals, and so that they have any real efficacy. And there's also, in this passage, he talks about this opposition between open morality and closed morality, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a reference to Bergson's book on the two sources of morality and religion, where he makes this opposition between open societies and closed societies, or open morality and closed morality. And so there would be, it's similar to this opposition between norms and values that Simondon has set out in the last couple paragraphs. And so a closed morality would be one in which there's a sort of functionalism of norms. So the moral, the set of norms is functional for the operation of a certain society, whereas the open society would be, or the open morality would be characterized by values that transcend any given social order. And so for Simondon, for Bergson, there's a sort of historical evolution from a closed morality to an open one, and he sees this as part of the moral development of humankind. Whereas Simondon is arguing that this is a sort of illusion, and there isn't really such a thing as an open morality and a closed morality. There are sort of open and closed sides to any ethical system or any ethical life, and so what we have to do is to grasp both those sides at the same time, rather than sort of regard one as being more advanced than the other. And I think this last bit toward the end of the page on 377, when he talks about how there are no deserted islands in becoming, I think that we can maybe tie this back in with his discussion of spirituality again, and his discussion of these sort of ephemeral moments of spirituality, like the gesture of the slave running away from his master. These sort of ephemeral gestures are, or the ephemeral acts of spirituality are not lost in the sense that they sort of disappear without leaving a trace. So they insofar as they are part of ethical life, they contribute to the formation of ethical life in the future. And so, even if the slave ends up being caught and killed or punished or whatever, and so their escape is not successful, there's still that gesture can still sort of be repeated and live on in ethical life in the future. So there's this capacity for ethical life to be structured in this network of acts, this set of acts that are integrated with each other, and create norms and values at the same time. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. So I think we're right at the top of 378. If someone else would like to pick up from there. No volunteers? Okay, I can read this one again. The act is neither matter nor form. It is becoming in the process of becoming. It is being to the extent that this being is by becoming. The relation between acts does not pass through the abstract level of norms, but it goes from one act to another, just as one goes from yellow-green to green and yellow by increasing the bandwidth of frequencies. The moral act is one that can spread out, phase shift into lateral acts, and link up with other acts by spreading out from its single active center. Far from being the encounter of a matter and a form, of an impulse and a norm, a desire and a rule, an empirical reality and a transcendental reality, the moral act is this reality that is more than unity and that spreads out from itself on both sides by joining with other realities of the same type. To reprise Malebranche's formula concerning freedom, according to which man is said to have movement to always go further, it could be asserted that the free act or the moral act is one that has enough reality to go beyond itself and encounter other acts. There is only a center of the act, there are no limits of the act. Each act is centered but infinite. The value of an act is its breadth, its capacity of transductive expansiveness. The act is not a unity in the path toward an end, which would imply a concatenation. An act that is only itself is not a moral act. The act that is a unity, that consists in itself, that does not radiate outward and that has no lateral bands, is effectively one, but it is inserted into becoming without belonging to becoming, without completing this phase shift of being that becoming is. The act that is more than unity, that cannot reside or consist only in itself, but also resides and is completed in an infinity of other acts, is an act whose relation to other acts is signification and possesses the value of information. By taking generosity as the foundation of morality, Descartes revealed this power of the act to extend beyond itself. But since he wanted to found a provisional morality, i.e. a morality that only looks ahead, he did not indicate the retroactive force of the act, which is just as important as its proactive force. Each act takes up the past again and encounters it anew. Each moral act resists becoming and does not allow itself to be covered over as past. Its proactive force is that through which it will always belong to the system of the present, able to be evoked again in its reality, extended, taken up again by an act, later on according to the date, but contemporaneous with the first act according to the dynamic reality of being's becoming. Acts construct a reciprocal simultaneity, a network that does not allow itself to be reduced to be reduced by the unidimensionality of the successive. An act is moral to the extent that it has, by virtue of its central reality, the power to eventually become simultaneous with respect to another act. A non-moral act is lost within itself, an act that is covered over and covers over a part of the subject's becoming. It is that which achieves a loss of being according to becoming. The non-moral act introduces a rift into the being that will prevent it from becoming simultaneous with respect to itself. If it exists, the immoral act is one that destroys the significations of acts that have existed or that will be able to be called on to exist. And instead of being localized within itself like the non-moral act, the immoral act is an act that introduces a schema of confusion, preventing other acts from structuring into a network. In this sense, the immoral act is not an act properly speaking, but like the inverse of an act, a becoming that absorbs and destroys the relational significations of other acts, that drags them into false paths of transductivity, that misleads the subject with respect to himself. The immoral act is a parasitic act, a false act that draws its semblance of signification from a random encounter. I think I'll stop here because this is a multi-page paragraph again. So he's continuing again with this notion of grasping the midpoint of the midpoint between norms and values, or the point out of which norms and values will be generated. So in the same way that we have to start from the yellow-green portion of the spectrum as the intermediate point, rather than starting from red and violet and trying to find a mixture of the two. So in the same way, we have to start from this act that is both norm and value at the same time, or that institutes norms and values at the same time. And so the moral act then is the one that allows for the formation of this network of acts with each other, so that they can have this internal resonance. They can that one act can be contemporary with another, even though they're separated by time. And so the two sort of contrasts with this are the non-moral acts. This would be an act that is sort of contained within itself and doesn't link up with other acts, that doesn't allow for the possibility of internal resonance to occur. And then the other opposition is the immoral act. And this is one that, so he says it's not properly speaking an act. It's sort of the counterpart to an act. It's something that destroys the signification of other acts, rather than forming a network with it and internal resonance. So this would be an act that some sort of action that destroys signification rather than allowing for signification to occur. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So we're on 379 at such is aestheticism, if someone would like to pick up from there. And can take us to the end. Whoever takes this part will have the honor of finishing the book for us.
Yeah, I can read it if there's nobody who wants to read.
Yeah, go for it, Ollie.
Okay. Such is it right? Such is it?
Yes, exactly.
Aestheticism is as counter morality, the unification of acts according to certain shared style and not according to their power of transductivity. As aestheticism is a parasite of moral becoming. It is a creation of abstract forms within the existence of the subject, the illusion of the unification according to these abstract forms. Aestheticism, which once ever no acts, deceives itself in a certain sense and becomes an iteration of a novelty according to extrinsic norm of novelty. In the same way, conformism or perpetual opposition to social norms is a resignation facing the characteristic of the actuality of the acts and a flight into a style of iteration according to positive forms of coincidence, or a negative form of opposition with respect to a given. Iteration expresses the tendency of an act to dominate all becoming, instead of ranking up with other acts. The non-moral or immoral act is one that, because it does not involve a relative inadequacy to itself and attempts to become perfect within its own limits, can only be recommenced and not continued. This act is egoistic in itself relative to other acts. It has a tendency to persevere in its being, which makes it such that it is excised from other acts, is not penetrated by them, cannot penetrate them, but only dominate them. Any moral act harbors a certain internal organization that situated it and remits it as an act. It develops according to a certain partially inhibitive regulation that inserts its existence as an act into a network of acts. The act in which there is no longer this index of totality and possibility of other acts, the act that provides itself with an asserty despite the genetic character of the emergence as a phase of becoming. The act that does not receive this measure, that is both activating and inhibitive, and arises from the network of other acts, is the wild and crazed act, which is in certain sense identical with the perfect act. Such an act is the one in which there is no longer the presence of this pre-individual reality that is associated with the individuated being. The wild act is one that tends toward the total individuation, that no longer admits anything as real except what is totally individuated. Acts are networked to the extent that they are considered on the ground of nature, the source of becoming via continued individuation. This wild and crazy act remains with only an internal normativity. It consists in self, sustains itself in the vertigo of its iterative existence. It observes and concentrates within itself all emotion and all action, makes the different representations of the subject converge towards it, and becomes a unique point of view. Every solicitation of the subject calls for the iteration of this act. The subject is reduced to individual as a result of single individuation, and the individual is reduced to the singularity of perpetually recommencing here and now. It is placed everywhere, like a being detached from the world and from other subject by abandoning its role of transfer. The last paragraph. Ethics is that through which the subject remains subject, refusing to become an absolute individual, closed domain of reality, or detached singularity. It is that through which the subject remains in an ever-charged internal, external problematic, i.e., in a real present, living on the central zone of being, not wanting to become either form or matter. Ethics expresses the meaning of the perpetuated individuation, the stability of becoming, which is that of the being as pre-individuated, individuating, tending toward the continuous that reconstructs it and organizes the form of a communication, a reality as vast as the pre-individual system across the individual, understood as the implicative transfer emerging from nature. Societies become a word.
Right, thank you. Yes, we finished the book.
Whoa.
So let's see if there. What do we want to talk about in this last bit? Right. So I think this last paragraph here. So ethics is that through which the subject remains subject. So the subject, if you remember, is something that contains the individual and also the pre-individual reality that that accompanies it. So the subject remains subject here because it grasps the subject stays at the level of the reality in which there is an individual and an associated non-individual reality. So this is refusing the sort of temptation or the idea of becoming a substantial reality, a reality that would be self-contained and would not include a pre-individual reality. So ethics means to hold on to the stage of being in which there is both an individual and a non-individuated milieu that accompanies it. And maybe one other point before we end. So there's this bit is kind of strange, but so he talks about this wild or crazed act, and he says this in a certain sense is identical with the perfect act. So this would be an act that is sort of self-contained. It would be he says it's one that tends toward the total individuation and no longer admits anything as real except what is totally individuated. So this would be an act that would have its own norms within itself that would not be governed by any sort of external principle, and it would be a sort of substantial reality in the sense that it doesn't require an associated milieu. It's something that subsists on its own as an individual, and so this would be the perfect act in the sense that it would be an act that is complete and self-contained. But because this is something that is impossible to achieve, this attempt at a perfect act is a sort of crazed act for Simondon. It's something that is a negative attempt, like to try to do this is something opposed to ethical life.
I wonder if this is related to that kind of strange suggestion in the section on anxiety that it's possible for the individual to kind of undergo a transformation via anxiety on its own, but that it would be extremely rare. Maybe that would result in something that's sort of only iterative rather than repeatable, like whatever this crazed act is.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. So in that passage, he talks about anxiety as being the sort of what happens to the individual if it tries to resolve its own problems on its own without entering into the collective. And then he has this weird remark where he says that maybe in a few rare cases it is possible to actually resolve these problems on one's own as an individual, and rather than going through the collective. So he at first says that it doesn't seem to be possible, but then he says in a few rare cases maybe it is. So maybe this crazed act is something that allows for the individual to resolve the problems at the level of the individual and not go through the collective. That's an interesting suggestion, but I think it's hard to say definitively one way or the other, given what's provided in the text for us.
I'm just thinking like wild and creates the act. Maybe like it's not that negative, because like it reminds me of like madness of Deleuze. So maybe I'm wrong, but it is kind of like it's a kind of like the source of singularity of individual. So it's a kind of like the source of like a genesis, like something new at the end of the day. Like, well, what do you think about that? Like, should we understand that was as a negative one. I think it can be some kind of like a stimulus of generating something new.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I think for Simondon, at least, there isn't really this sense of sort of trying to take madness as something that would have like a functional side to it, in the way that other authors sometimes use it. I think for him, this term does have a negative connotation, but I think we can potentially argue along the lines that you're suggesting, that there could be something like a role of a kind of madness or crazed act as something that generates something new, that allows for the formation of a new set of a new network of acts and a new system of ethical life. The only sort of caution that I would put to that is that so here Simondon in the last couple of paragraphs, he talks about aestheticism and the way that in an aestheticism, novelty becomes a norm of its own. So doing something original or new or inventive becomes a norm, and so this system in which the new is a norm is a way of sort of only grasping one side of ethical life. It allows you to set up this norm of novelty, but it doesn't allow you to grasp the values at the same time. So I think for Simondon, he would want to see something that would set up norms and values together, rather than something that institutes novelty as a norm in itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, agreed. Actually, that's the point. I'm just confused a little bit still, like, cause like, what is a core value like a human being would take as a something like to pass down information, to pass down to the next generation or next individual or something like that. So can norm and the value can be identical? I mean, go together always? Yeah, it's still, I don't know. It's a little bit confusing here. What exactly Simondon, I mean, implies here.
Yeah, so I think you're right to talk about passing on from one generation to the next, but I think there's also the sense of something that can sort of overcome distances of time and space. So you can so a value would be something that or an act would have value insofar as it is something that can be sort of reenacted or reincarnated in a new moment. So the slave escaping from his master in the 3rd century BC or whenever is something that action can be repeated in a completely different social context in, say, the 19th century Jamaica or whatever. The same act can be, or a repetition, a reenactment of that act can occur, or an act can enter into resonance into this network with an act that previously occurred in a completely different context. And so it's insofar as the acts have this capacity of entering into relations with each other across time and space and different cultures. It's to that extent that they have value for Simondon.
Yeah, sure. True. And then later, maybe like we would have a chance like to talk about like what specific examples of Simongdonian value like could be.
Yeah, that's a good question, because he leaves it open here, and I think that's deliberate. Because if he were to say, like, here's a list of values, and here are the values that ethical life should be governed by, then those values immediately become norms, right? They become um, they become the principles of a particular ethical life, rather than something that transcends a given ethical life. Um, so I think I think it's hard to sort of pin down a value to say that, like, our value is X or our value is Y. I think, as he puts it here, there's a historicity to values, so they emerge in a historical context, but then they transcend that context and connect with other acts in different contexts. So I think, from the few examples that he gives, I think we can talk about the slave escaping as an instance of an act that has value, and so there would be a certain value. I guess we can call it a value of freedom, or a value of equality. So a resistance to a system of domination of one individual over another. I think we can sort of extract these values from what he's describing here, but we always have to we always have to avoid the danger of the values sort of falling back into norms, and just being a system of norms of a particular ethical life, rather than being something that uh, transcends any given ethical life.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? We're pretty much at time. We have a couple minutes.
Oh, sorry, 61. Did you want to say something?
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, it's this description of norms and values seems to be it's pretty content free. Like you were just saying, he doesn't give us many examples of acts that he would consider to be valuable. And I wonder if, I don't know, I guess if this this way of thinking of norms and values as kind of repeatable acts in like a system of internal resonance could encompass like acts that we would clearly see as immoral. If it's kind of like totally content free. I mean, not immoral in Simondon's sense, but there could be actions that probably everybody in this group would agree are immoral, but are consistent with a network of actions of norms and values within a given sort of social system that might be moral acts in accordance with the definition of moral acts that he gives here.
Yeah, this is a sort of general question about formalism in relation to ethics. So any type of ethical system, or system of ethics that tries to account for ethical life in formal terms, as opposed to material terms, in terms of content, would have this issue of and this is an objection that's often raised in connection with Kant's notion of the formal principle of acting in accordance with duty. And there's, of course, the famous case of Eichmann, who apparently thought it was his duty to operate the Holocaust in the efficient bureaucratic manner, and so the sort of formal principle of acting in accordance with duty seems to allow for something completely immoral to sort of fit in as a kind of duty. But I think what Simondon would argue is that the kind of ethics that he's talking about here is not a formal one, because that opposition between a formal ethics and then the content of ethics is already a form matter distinction, and it's precisely the form matter distinction that he's trying to get away from, and so I think he would see the system of ethics that he's presenting here as not as a formal one, but as one out of which form and matter are generated, or form and content are generated. But you're right that it requires some interpretation, I guess, to apply this to a particular case, and it's always there's always the possibility that someone can apply it in ways that we would find objectionable, and so like if the gesture of the slave escaping the master is an act that can form a network with other acts and so on, then we can ask also, is the action of the slave master who captures the slave, is that an action that can form a network with other acts? And you could point to other slave owners throughout history that have acted in similar ways and sort of come up with a like an anti-network of acts of slave owners throughout history. So yeah, I think there's always the possibility. I think any ethical system will, or system of principles of ethics will always allow for that possibility that it can be sort of applied in a perverse sense. I think I don't think there's any way to come up with like a perfect system of norms that would sort of preclude a perverse interpretation. And I think that's sort of what he's pointing to when he talks about how norms and how there's always this complementarity of norms and values. So any system of norms has to sort of allow for the capacity of being transcended and being overcome and being replaced by a new system of norms for that very reason. So I think we're pretty much at time now. So yeah, we finished the book itself. So the Simondon's thesis, which makes up volume 1 of the translation. And so what I have suggested is that we look at the translation of the Cavaillés and Lotman text that I did. I posted a while ago. We can look at that first, and that'll take probably a couple weeks, and then we can go on to volume 2 of the book and look at the complementary texts that go along with it. Yeah, so thanks for accompanying me on this long journey through the text, but I think I've definitely gotten a lot out of it, and I hope everyone else has as well.
Thank you for leading this
okay.
amazing group.
Okay, so see you all next week, hopefully, and we'll pick up from there.